Welcome to this video lecture. Myself Atul Kumar, working as an assistant professor in Department of Computer Science, Rajiv Gandhi Memorial, Government College, Jogindanagar. In this video lecture, I will discuss about entity relationship diagram. So, entity relationship diagram is basically the pictorial representation of a ER model. So, when we represent a ER model pictorially, so that is called as ER diagram. So there are different kind of conventions used in ER diagram. So entity is basically a instance of entity type. So to represent entity in the ER diagram, it is basically represented by a rectangle enclosing its name. So entity is always be represented with the help of a rectangle. Diamonds are used to represent relationships. So diamond is like a shape like this. So to represent a relationship we use diamond shape, and the link between entity and relationships are with the help of a lines. And we know each entity has attributes that represent the basic characteristics of the entity, and to represent those attributes in the ER diagram, ellipses are used. So to if there is a ellipse in the diagram, that ellipse is for uh, attribute. So to represent attributes we use ellipse. So next, double ellipses are used to represent multi-valued attributes. We know there are different types of attributes in ER model, like multi-value attributes, derived attributes, composite attributes. So double ellipses, like the shape of double ellipse is like this. So double ellipse is used to represent multi-valued attribute. Next, dotted ellipses are used to represent dotted attributes, like we have this one is a dotted attribute and dotted ellipse, and it is used to represent this derived attribute. Next we have ellipses emanating from ellipses shows composite attribute. The meaning of this is we have a ellipse like this, and some other ellipses are emanated from this ellipse, so this is called as composite attribute. Next we have a underline name inside a ellipse indicate primary key attributes. So if we have like this roll number and it is underlined, this means this attribute is a primary key attribute. Next, the big entity is represented by a double rectangle. So big entity is represented with the help of double rectangle. Double diamonds are used to represent a relationship for big entity. So double diamond we have like this, and these diamonds are used to represent uh, relationships for the big entity. Next we have a underline attribute that I have mentioned above. Underline attribute indicates the primary key attributes. So this one is the basically symbols and meanings in ER diagram. Firstly we have entity, and entity is represented with the help of a rectangle. So this rectangle is used to represent entity. Next we have a double rectangle, and if we have a weak entity in the diagram, then this is represented with the help of double rectangle. Next we have a diamond shape, and diamond shape is used to represent a relationship. Next we have a double diamond, and it is used to identify the relationships among the weak entities. Next we have ellipse, and to represent a ellipse we use ellipse, and it is the representation of attribute. Next we have multi-valued attribute. To represent a multi-valued attributes we use a double ellipse. Next we have a derived attributes, so dotted ellipse is used to represent a derived attribute. Next we have uh, composite attributes, so when ellipse are emanated from other ellipse, then it is a composite attribute. Next we have a total participation for weak entity, and this one is represented with this kind of symbol. Next we have a primary key, so the primary key attribute is always presented with the help of a name by underlining that name. Next we have a cardinality, so cardinality is how many instances of one entity are related to how many instances of the other uh, entity, so they are represented by this kind of relationships, this kind of diagram or symbol. Next we have a cardinality m is to n, so m is to n, we write m right here and n on the other side of the relationship, so this is the cardinality showing m is to n relationships. Next this one is the example number one to just showcase you the ER diagram. So in this example consider a case where the shopkeeper can order for at most 15 books, and each book or a book can be ordered by 10 shopkeepers. The two entity types we have in this example, one entity is shopkeeper and other entity is book, are connected by a relationship orders. So orders is a relationship, so to represent this kind of entity relationship model we use a ER diagram. So the ER diagram for this is like this: we have a book and shopkeeper as a entity represented by a rectangle, and the name of the entity is written inside this rectangle. Next the we have a diamond shape like and this is used to represent a relationships, and orders is the name of the relationship. We have different kind of attributes for the book entity like book id, book title, book author, book price, book publisher, and last name. So in these attributes book id is a primary key, as there is a underline below this book id, so it is a primary key. Next this one is a derived attribute, book author. So book author name may be the first and the last name, so we derive first name and last name from the book author, and this attribute is a derived attribute. Also the cardinality is 10 is to 15, 0 comma 10. That means 10 books are ordered by no, 10 books, a book can be ordered by 10 shopkeepers. And also in the right hand side the cardinality is 0 comma 15. This means shopkeeper can order at most 15 books. Also we have in this shopkeeper we have primary key shop id, as underline is below shop id, and the phone number ph underscore, this attribute is uh, double line ellipse, and for doubly ellipse we have a multiple values, as phone number may have multiple values. it may be landline number of the attribute, landline number of the shopkeeper, residence number of the shopkeeper. So to represent a multi-value attribute, we use this doubly ellipse, double line ellipse. Next, in ER model, ER diagram, we have two kinds of entities. One is weak entity and other is strong entity set. So the weak entity is the entity that doesn't have sufficient attributes to form a primary key. So in case of weak entity, if the entity doesn't have sufficient attributes to form a primary key, and also that weak entity depends upon the other entity for its identification, then that entity is called as weak entity. So the weak entity doesn't have a sufficient attributes to provide a primary key, and also it relies on another entity for its identification, so it is called as weak entity. So the entity that has a primary key is called as strong entity. So there are two kind of entities, one is weak entity and other is strong entity, and the strong entity has a primary key that uniquely identify a particular tuple or row in the entity set. So the primary key basically is the key that uniquely identify the entities. So the weak entity we know has not has doesn't have any kind of primary key. So the weak entity set always has a partial key, and which is a attribute that can uniquely identify weak entity. So with the help of partial key we can uniquely identify weak entities. But to just create the primary key of the weak entity, we use this kind of partial key, and the partial key is also called as discriminator of the weak entity. So partial key is also known as discriminator. Also the primary key of the weak entity is created with the help of or by combining the partial key or discriminator of the weak entity set and the primary key of the strong entity set. For example, in this relation we have two kinds of table in this diagram. One is a employee table and other is a dependent relation, or one is a employee and other is a dependent relation. So in case of employee we have a employee ID, and this one is a primary key. Why it is a primary key? Because it uniquely identify each row in the employee table, as the employee ID for each employee is different from the every other employee, so it is a primary key. But in case of the second relation, that is a dependent relation, in this case we have not such kind of ID. We have only the attributes like name, sex, birth date and relationships. So if we use this name as a key for this dependent relation, so the name of two persons may be same. So this one is not a complete key or a primary key. So to make this as a complete key, so this one is a partial key, name is a partial key. So to make this as a complete primary key, we use the primary key of the dependent relation, that is employee relation. So the we to make a complete key, we use we combine the primary key of employee relation and the name key attribute of dependent relation, and this one is the complete primary key. So the primary key here, primary key is equal to employee ID plus name, and name here is a partial key of the dependent relation and employee id is the primary key. So the primary key of dependent relation is equal to the employee id and the name, that is the partial key of this dependent relation. So uh, dependent table, uh, so the primary key we make with the help of this employee id and the name in case of this weak entity set dependent. So how to represent these weak entity set and strong entity sets in a ER diagram? So in this figure you can see employee is a strong entity, so we represent employee as a single line triangle, and here their employee id, imp id is a primary key, as there is an underline below this to make to represent this employee id as a primary key. Similarly we have a dependent, and this dependent is a weak entity, so we present weak entity with the help of rectangle, doubly lined rectangle, and here primary key name is a partial key, so name is also represented with the help of line underline below it. And to represent the relationship between dependent and employee, we use has relationship, and it is also a doubly diamond shaped relationship, as dependent is totally dependent on this employee. So I have discussed earlier the different symbols, and in that symbol we have a total relationship, and this one represent a total relationship. So we use double line to represent the total relationship, and total relationship here is means total relationship. Here total relationship means that the dependent entity has has no independent existence, dependent no independent existence. So this dependent entity has no independent existence, so it depends upon employee entity for its existence. So that is why this dependent entity is called as weak entity, and this employee entity is a strong entity. So and to make the primary key to make the primary key of this weak entity, we use so to make this the primary key of this entity, we make use of this partial key, and we combine this partial key with this employee primary key, employee id primary key of employee, and this makes the primary key of this dependent entity. So thanks for watching this video lecture.